Well, Mark, welcome back to the show. It's been a couple years, but it's great to visit with you.
Yeah, Cable, I appreciate you having me. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk to you and to your listeners.
Yeah, so for our listening audience, any of them who aren't familiar with the NSSF, give us just a brief overview of what you guys do exactly.
Yeah, so NSSF stands for National Shooting Sports Foundation, and we are the Firearm Industry Trade Association. We represent all your major manufacturers, both for firearms and ammunition, not just the manufacturers, but also the distributors, the retailers, ranges, and some endemic media, folks like yourself who are dedicated to talking about the outdoors or firearm ownership.
Hmm. And
For
so,
most
what have
people,
you?
yeah, I'd probably say most people are familiar with NSSF because we're the ones that put on SHOT Show. So that's
Right.
probably where they would see and kind of tie in NSSF with things that they might be familiar with.
And you're joining us from Virginia today.
Yeah, I'm in Virginia. I work out of our Washington, D.C. office. I work for the government relations team. I do all the policy communications for both federal and state affairs for all the work that they're doing in all 50 state capitals and on Capitol Hill.
And so, what issues have you been like? What has Mark been up to over the last, I don't know, month?
Well, a lot of it is fighting back against some of these overreaches by the Biden administration, especially on issues that are these final rules that are coming out of the ATF. Probably most recent has been the engaged in the business rule that it would require anybody who's going to privately sell a firearm from one individual to another. So if I was going to sell UK with one of my
Hmm.
guns, that would now require me to get an FFL, a federal firearms license, and become just like any other brick and mortar firearm retailer. Required to have that license, be open for inspection by the ATF, maintain records in perpetuity, run a background check on everybody who's going to buy a firearm. So it's a pretty onerous rule, and you've got lawmakers on Capitol Hill that are pushing back on that. There have been a couple other final rules that have been pushed out by the ATF that we're obviously fighting back against, but probably one of the other ones that's taking up a lot of our time and energy these days is the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security has published an interim final rule that would negate the way that we've been doing firearm exports for years, for decades in America. So now any company that exports a firearm overseas would require to have that license renewed every year versus the prior way that they were doing it was every 4 years. There's now going to be a presumption of denial when they attempt to get that license to export a firearm instead of a presumption of approval. And it's going to make it much more difficult for uh, firearm businesses to be able to export both firearms and ammunition to overseas markets. And this really is part of the Biden administration's whole of government approach to attacking this industry because they don't like us. We are politically disfavored by this administration. And so they want to attack the industry. And they feel if they can make enough damage to the industry and hurt enough manufacturers, it would go after the Second Amendment and the ability for you to be able to exercise your Second Amendment freedoms to keep and bear arms, and that's a very real concern to us.
Hmm. So obviously they don't have the votes in Congress to institute like he's made it no secret like he wants to implement an AR ban. Like that's it. He's talked about it
Yeah,
many times in his presidency. And
yeah,
I'm sure he'll run, although he'll put that in his campaign as he tries to get reelected. But they don't have the votes for that. So these other little, roundabout things just make it more inconvenient for gun owners. Is really the only thing they can do, I guess. But
yeah.
it doesn't make it any less annoying or unconstitutional.
And that's the point, Cable, is that you're right. They don't have the votes. Democrats control the Senate, but it is not a filibuster-proof majority. It's you need 60 votes in the Senate to get past there. And even if we look at, this a ban on this, what they call assault rifles, or what we call modern sporting rifles, which is the most popular selling centerfire rifle in America today. There are
Hmm.
over 28 million of these rifles in circulation. And that's more popular than there are Ford F-150s on the road today. So you talk about the most popular selling pickup truck in America. There are more of these rifles in private ownership and out there in circulation. So, yeah, they want to go after that. They don't have the votes. Of course, you have the House is controlled by Republicans by a very thin majority right now. Senate is controlled by Democrats. You have divided Congress, and then of course you have divided government because the White House is controlled by the Biden administration. So they can't get anything through. So you're right. What they're trying to do is go around Congress and create these rules that would have the effect of law. And that's when what you're seeing in these legal challenges to these rules is that the rules that have been published by this administration through the ATF are sidestepping Congress. Congress alone has the authority to write criminal law. And these rules that have been published essentially assign a crime and a penalty if you were to break this rule.
Yeah.
That's not what the framers had in mind when they, set up our government, when we had a separation of powers. Congress writes the law, the executive branch, the White House, the administration enforces the law. What we're seeing here is that the administration is creating law out of whole cloth, and they don't have the authority to do that. And I think that's what you're seeing being challenged up through the courts right now. The other day, we saw there was a federal court down in Texas that said
Yeah,
they
I saw
engaged in the
this.
business rule. Yeah, they engaged in the business rule is unconstitutional. And so they've put a temporary restraining order on it being enforced in the state of Texas. So I'm sure that will be continuing a legal battle along the way. And I don't think it'll be limited to just the state of Texas. I think we're going to see that they'll be looking for an expansion across all 50 states. I know that Republican attorneys general have expressed outrage and have sued the government against this. So I think we're going to see right up through the election, we're going to see continual battle in the courtrooms. Now, if the election goes toward President Trump, then I think you're going to see a reversal very quickly of a lot of these rules that have been published. But I think if the election goes toward President Biden and he is reelected, then you're going to see these court battles continue. And I think you're going to see an even bolder overreach by the administration to limit your Second Amendment rights.
Yeah. Well, and for example, I don't sell a lot of guns. I like to keep all my guns, but I have a neighbor who wanted to purchase his first handgun, and he's in the reserves. He's in the Navy, actually, Air Force Reserve. Sorry, Mickey, if you're listening. But he wanted a pistol for the house, so I sold him one. We just wrote a little bill of sale. We both signed it. Here's your gun. Here's my paperwork. That's it. Now I have to, according to this, like get a federal firearms license to do that simple transaction with a buddy.
Yeah, it's pretty onerous, and it's going to require you to now become licensed and inspected and maintain those records in perpetuity.
I'm not a gun dealer.
It's a lot to ask. Yeah, and the interesting thing is that the ATF has limited resources. There have been complaints, and we've actually worked with Congress to provide more resources to ATF so that they are able to conduct the inspections. We want to make sure that guns are staying out of the hands of those people who should never have them. But this really is going a step too far, and this really is trying to go after your personal rights to be able to transfer a firearm to somebody that you've known for years. Right now the way the rule is set up is it's not supposed to affect transfers within close family, but it would affect your ability to transfer that handgun to a neighbor. And that becomes concerning because what if you had a neighbor who you knew was a victim of spousal abuse and that neighbor had gotten a restraining order against an abusive husband, and you wanted to make sure that neighbor was able to protect herself. So you said, hey, I'm going to give you this handgun to be able to protect yourself in the interim so you can get this straightened out. Well, if you transfer that handgun without a background check now, you've just committed a felony under
just lending it to them.
Just lending it to them, because that is a transfer. That is handing that gun from your possession to theirs. So this becomes very concerning about the.
I'd be a two-time felon in the last 2 weeks because I also lent one to a guy who was taking a class and he needed a 9mm and he didn't have one, so I was like, "Here, yeah, you can use mine."
Yeah. So it becomes real concerning, and it really does become a limit on our ability to exercise our freedoms to be able to help out other people who maybe just wanting to learn about the shooting sports or want to learn about hunting. You've got a buddy who wants to go turkey hunting this past spring, and you lent him a shotgun for the season. Well, that would now require a transfer because it leaves your possession and goes into that person's possession. So it becomes very concerning.
The first turkey I ever shot was with a borrowed shotgun. My buddy, I had a Remington 870, and I needed, at the time, was like, I got to get 3.5-inch shells. So my buddy lent me his Mossberg pump.
Yeah.
And he was like, you can borrow it. Do not clean it. It's never been cleaned, and we're not going to start cleaning it now. I shot my first turkey with that gun. But like something as innocent as that, like that's what
Yeah.
that's the mindset of this administration. We can't do what we want to through the actual legal system, so we're going to circumvent that and write our own law,
It,
which like
it yeah, it
it's my
really is
it's
pretty
infuriating.
egregious.
Mm,
Yeah, it is, and it's what I've been trying to term to people as it's a whole of government approach. This isn't just the ATF that they're using as a bludgeon, which the Biden administration promised they would do this even when they were campaigning for office. They said
mhm,
that they were going to do this, and they're following through with it.
yep.
But they're using every other part of government as well. They're using the Commerce Department, they're using the Interior Department, they're using everything that they can to limit your ability to get out and enjoy the hunting and shooting sports.
Well, yeah, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is. I mean, that's a whole nother thing. And I was visiting with. I think Gabriella Hoffman. She's I think a mutual
Yeah,
friend of ours. We were visiting earlier this week, and we were just talking about, you know, all these organizations, SCI, various other ones, asked her like, "Will you commit to no net loss hunting policy?" And she wouldn't do it. And now we
yeah,
have this BITA rule would basically limit sportsmen's ability to use the National Wildlife Refuge System based on the premise of closing 400 out of 570, I think, due to climate change initiatives. We're closing it. You
yeah.
can't hunt there because of climate change. Are you serious?
Yeah,
Like,
it really flips the Biden rule on its head, and the proposed uh, revisions to the Biden rule have really been pushed back against this administration, against the Interior Department for the proposals on this, for that very reason. Is the whole idea of the Biden rule is that the people who are paying for these public lands, for paying for the conservation of these public lands, would now be shut out of it, and it would be shut out of it for special interest, climate concerns
mm,
that don't really have a basis in science. And that's been what
right.
some of the lawmakers have been asking Secretary Holland is show me the science behind this. And she hasn't been able to produce that science. And it's important to remember that, today's hunter, today's, firearm industry, we are the ones who are paying for the conservation of wildlife in America today, and not just the wildlife, but also the habitats that they enjoy and the public spaces that you and I are supposed to be able to get out to and enjoy. And this administration's idea of conservation is radically different than ours. They have a preservationist idea
Yeah.
and not necessarily a conservationist idea. The conservationist means that we're an integral part of this, conserving of our resources. The preservationist idea is that they're going to put a big glass wall around everything and just let it be, and we would have nothing to do with that. Well, that's not how it works, and it's not going
Mm-mm.
to be sustainable. And we know that if we don't have an integral part in preserving our freedoms and our ability to get out and hunt and be able to access these public lands, they will go wasted, and we'll have a lot bigger concerns down the road.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I did a little digging on that new bit of proposal change, and I found this lady, Jenny Keatinge, who is now a policy writer advisor for the National Wildlife Refuge System, put in place by Deb Howland, or whoever she appointed as head of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Right? I mean, Deb oversees
Yeah,
that.
Director Martha Williams. Yeah,
Yes. Okay. So she put this gal, Jenny Keatinge, in there on her LinkedIn. This is her employment history: Center for Biological Diversity, Defenders of
yeah,
Wildlife, Humane Society of the United States, and there's some other anti-hunting entities in her 12-year career. But I'm like, that's the hat trick. That's the holy grail of
yeah,
anti-hunting, anti-North American conservation model. Right there, you've got the three worst, most egregious offenders, and she worked for all of them.
yeah.
And now she's writing policy for sportsmen and women. Like, what the hell?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it is. It's a little astonishing when you sit back. Now, these three groups are also three groups that are known for what they call a sue and settle scheme. So they
Mm-hmm.
will sue the government, whether it be the EPA or the Interior or U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they do this regularly. They sue them, and then these agencies will go into settlement talks and will basically give them everything that they want in that lawsuit, under the guise of this threat of a lawsuit. So
And pay their legal fees.
and pay the legal fees. Yeah, so we actually saw that was as part of the reason that right now you're seeing the traditional ammunition lead bans happening on national wildlife refuges because Center for Biological Diversity had threatened lawsuits over the use of traditional ammunition, saying that it was causing, harmful wildlife population impacts, which is not true. They've not been able to show that. So when they published the proposed rule on this, they were talking about that, it affects, eagles and affects all sorts of raptors. And they talked about the California condor, but they were talking about national wildlife refuges where I live here in Virginia. They were talking about wallops, and they were talking about Chincoteague and Assateague National Wildlife Refuges. Well, last time I checked, we don't have California condors flying over
Right.
here in Virginia. I don't think we've ever had California condors flying over here in Virginia, even pre-Columbian times. Um, so it's a pretty radical idea to think that we're gonna put a blanket policy across the entire United States. What we're saying is show us the site-specific, peer-reviewed scientific evidence that shows that there is a harmful population impact. Well, we know that's not true. What we can actually show is that because you have hunters and you have the fire industry invested in conservation in this, that we're seeing wildlife actually teem. We're seeing wildlife take off. Bald eagles are not on the endangered species list. They're not on the threatened species list.
Right.
They're not even monitored by the federal
You
government.
probably see them in Virginia. I see them down here in Texas in the wintertime.
I tell people all the time, if you want to see bald eagles, go to the nearest dump. You're going to see eagles flying over that dump all the time. And that's where they're getting a lot of this nasty stuff that they're ingesting into their body. Yeah, they eat a lot of the other stuff. And people all the time, they talk about, well, this, the lead that's left over from a shot animal. Well, there's a couple of options that can happen with that. You can take the entire animal out of the field and field dress it outside of the field, which is what I do. I tend not to dress my animals in the field. Or you can bury whatever gut pile or carrion that is left in the field. You can bury that down so that the raptors aren't going to eat that.
Even if you didn't, how many times would they have to do that for it to kill them?
Yeah, and
I know
now
we're
so
not
raptors
scientists,
are
right? But
yeah. So raptors are particularly susceptible because the digestive system of a raptor is a little bit different than ours. They will dissolve. They will eat that lead, and it will get into their system and into their blood. But that's not the way it works with America. So they talk about, we're worried about, harmful lead impacts on people who are consuming wild game. Well, over 400 years of hunting wild game in North America with lead-based ammunition, there's never been one case of anybody suffering from lead poisoning. So the lead that's used in ammunition is not water soluble. It doesn't get into the water system. It doesn't get dissolved into the human system. So it's a negligible idea. In 2008, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention actually did a study, and they checked in North Dakota about hunters who were consuming wild game to see what their blood lead levels were in comparison to the ambient population around them. Interestingly, they found out that the blood lead levels of hunters consuming wild game was actually lower than that of the ambient population around them.
wow.
So it is not something that has ever been a concern. And
Maybe
yet
all
we
that
see
nasty
that
stuff we
see
put in our bodies.
we
Go
see a lot of
hunting.
fear mongering going on.
Safer.
And they use this image of a poor sick eagle, which everyone does. If you want to see a poor sick eagle, you go to a raptor center, you're going to find it. But if you want to see a poor sick human, you're going to go to a hospital and you're going to see that. But that's not representative of the population of America. The population of Americans is overall very healthy. So, I think it's cherry picking the data, and it's cherry picking things that are going to tug at the hearts of people who are very concerned about animals, even people like you and I who appreciate wildlife and want to see it perpetuated in the future, but also want to be able to use that as a resource.
Well, there's this shift towards using social science or the court of public opinion and using that to replace actual science. And for one example I have is I recently had this guy on from Michigan. He was a predator caller, mostly hunted coyotes at night.
Yeah.
A group of houndsmen didn't like that those guys were shooting a lot of coyotes and thought these guys are killing all of the coyotes that we want to chase with our dogs. Well, they successfully got the Michigan DNR, whatever it is, to close the season for 3 months.
Yeah.
No scientific data to support it. And Michigan had a rule, I think from the 90s, where if wildlife regulation was going to be changed, there had to be science to support it. Well, when they accepted these guys' demands, they said, well, we're going to use social science as the science. That was their grounds for changing it and closing what was a year-long season. Now it's 9 months. And hunters did this to themselves, but the antis were able to say, "Oh, social science. That's actual science." No, it isn't. That's the court of public
Yeah,
opinion. That's social
yeah,
media. Yeah.
yeah.
So
Yeah, it's difficult and it's hard to, to try to talk to with the hunting community and make folks like us understand that if you hunt with a bow and you may never hunt with a gun, maybe that's your choice that you want to hunt with a bow. Well, we still have the same vested interest, me as a gun hunter and you as a bow hunter. It's the same arguments I think that we saw when I was growing up, when, I was learning to use a compound bow, and you had a lot of the traditionalists saying, well, you shouldn't be able to use, any kind of wheeled bow out there. And
mhm.
then you kind of saw that same thing happening with, folks who were starting to transition to using crossbows. Well, that's not fair. But again,
Right.
when we start to do this to ourselves, I think we're really hurting ourselves. We see it on the firearm side too. People say, well, you shouldn't be able to use night optics. You shouldn't be able to use this type of optic. As long as you're hunting that animal in a legal method, and you're doing it with an ethical pursuit of that animal. The animal has a fair chaseability, that you have to get out there and hunt. You're not shooting a penned up animal. Then I think we can all agree that this is going to be sustainable. It's going to get more people. We see the hunting numbers coming down because a lot of hunters are aging out. So we want to be able
Mhm.
to invigorate people. And just because the technology has changed to make hunting a little more accessible to some people doesn't mean that the traditions of hunting and the ethics of hunting have changed at all.
Mhm. Well, I'll be careful with that word pin though, because you're talking to a Texan. There's high fences on every highway, right?
Yeah,
And to
I would
me,
I would argue that a 2,000 acre ranch is not a pen. So,
right, right,
and
yeah,
and I've hunted some Texas ranches. So yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm not interested in a high fence that's probably less than 500 at a bare minimum. And I've hunted. It took me, just to put that into perspective, I've killed a bunch of axis deer in my life, but the first one that I ever shot, it took me, I think, 6 trips to my buddy's 500-acre ranch to kill an
yeah,
axis buck. 6 trips. What? Kill a whitetail on
yeah,
the first time down there. Like
yeah.
they
Caleb,
were.
I hate to admit this, but I'm 0 for 2 right now hunting out in West Texas for axis. It's my first time was I rushed the shot, I
Mhm.
blew it. That was my fault. Last spring, I was able to get back down, and I had an opportunity in the last 5 minutes of the last day, and it just wasn't a very well placed shot. I think I hit him in no man's land, just below the spine, where it was non-lethal hit. So we had nothing to really work with. But I'm determined. I feel like this axis, and I've harvested an axis before. I've got, much like you with the axis, behind you. I've got one hanging in my office, a pellet just like that. But I'm still looking after that real nice stag that I want to be able to put on the wall and put in the
Oh yeah.
freezer. And it's become my white whale now. I tell people this has become my Moby Dick.
Uh,
That trying to chase after this animal is just killing
I
me
love
now.
them,
So
but
I'm
they're
still
smart.
still after it.
I think
Yeah,
they're.
they're
I'll
wary
be
and
honest. I think they might be in certain places a little more wary than white-tailed deer.
yeah.
Um,
Oh
but
yeah, yeah. I mean, we had, in fact, when this last hunt I had whitetail hanging out in the field, 20, 30 minutes, just hanging out, no problem. They didn't care about anything. Of course, this was not during whitetail season. They didn't have any pressure anyway, but
uh
whitetail are not afraid of that open space. The axis, I think any of us who have hunted them will tell you is they're going to come in and they're going to get out very, very
oh
quickly.
yeah,
So you got to make your mind up very quickly on that animal.
yeah. Well, so one of the things I really wanted to discuss today is the mechanism by which conservation is funded in this country. Pittman Robertson Act, I think 1937, uh, put in place by sportsmen, thankfully. Um,
Yeah,
but people that don't hunt also contribute heavily to the Pittman Robertson funding
yeah,
initiative, and I'm assuming, and you can correct me here because we use obviously your knowledge on this, but I would assume 9mm and 223 are the two most popular calibers sold in America.
yeah. You're not wrong. Yeah, they absolutely are. So yeah,
Okay.
it's we were actually very proud this past year. We just topped $17 billion that have been paid in. That's actual dollars paid
Mhm.
into Pittman Robertson funds
I read the
since.
article. That's
Yeah,
27 billion adjusted for inflation.
yeah, yeah. So when you start to adjust it out, in these past couple of years, especially with, we've had over 1 million background checks for the sale of a gun for goodness, going on 56, 57 months now. So I mean, if people don't believe it, this is the new norm of having over 1 million background checks a month. But people are buying those guns and they're shooting. And while people like you and I may go out and hunt, I remind people that it really is today's recreational target shooter that is carrying the load for conservation. And I try to put it in very simple terms. I may go out for hunting season, and let's say I'm going to check the zero on my rifle. Let's say it takes me 5 rounds to verify my zero. And then say I use 1, maybe 2 rounds to harvest the deer that I'm chasing. So I've used 7 rounds out of a box of 20. So that box of
Right.
20 is going to last 2 to 3 years, right? Now, when I go to the range on a Saturday and I take my AR-15 and I take my handgun with me, I'm starting with 100 rounds per frame. So I'm going to use 100 rounds for the rifle. I'm going to use 100 rounds for the handgun. And that's just for having about an hour's worth of fun or so on a range with a couple of buddies. So when we start to look at that, I've used 7 rounds in the year to hunt 1 deer, but I've used 100 rounds on a Saturday or 200 rounds on a Saturday just to go have fun with my buddies and keep my skills sharp. So really is the recreational target shooter. And it goes beyond that. Think about when you go out and shoot a sporting clays course. When we go out and hunt ducks, yeah, I would love to tell you that I'm a one-shot guy when it comes to ducks, but let's be honest, it's going to take me a few shots to
Right.
put
I'd say dove is the one, and Texas Parks and Wildlife has done studies over the years, and they say, which it always makes me feel good because it doesn't take me this many, but they say the average hunter takes 7 shots per dove. You can kill 15 dove times 7 shots. I'm more like 2.5 this
You're doing
past
a little better
season.
than me. There are days that dove will absolutely humble me, and then there are days I'm a little bit better and I'm moving the gun the way I should. But yeah, I mean, when you go out and shoot a round of sporting clays, it's 100 rounds just to shoot sporting clays, and all that
Mm-hmm.
money is going back toward conservation. That tax is paid by the manufacturers on the wholesale price the first time it's sold. So when the manufacturer sells it to the distributor, they're paying the tax on that box of ammunition. They're paying the tax on that gun as it leaves the factory. And
Mm-hmm.
that tax is going in all the time directly to conservation. And one of the unique parts about Pittman Robertson Fund is that the money that comes out of those taxes really is truly in one of the very few lock boxes that Congress actually talks about. You hear these politicians talk about, we're going to put this in a lockbox, no one can ever touch it. Well, they raid those lockboxes all the time. But because the way the law was written in 1937, that money can be used for nothing other than conservation efforts. And that money is distributed back to the states based on the number of hunting licenses that are sold, based on the population, and based on the geography of the land, how much land mass is available. So it's a pretty complex formula, but that money gets distributed back to the states so they can invest it in conservation projects. I see it here, especially along the East Coast with black bear, collaring bear, and they're moving them out. We work with the manufacturers in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department to take folks out to see how that money is being spent. Anytime that you're seeing collared deer, or you're doing, kind of population counts on different animals, all the wildlife, the ducks, the pheasant, the quail, all those animals that we hunt and enjoy, that money's going back to preserving those habitats and working to make sure that we
Mm-hmm.
have healthy populations. But
Yeah,
it
in
goes
that
beyond
same
that. When you
article
have
I
a healthy,
read, oh, sorry,
go
I
ahead.
was going to say in that same article that I read on your website, from like an annual impact, I think it said $944 million were
Yeah,
allocated to the states. I don't know if that's for last year or for this year, but
yeah,
that money is
it was the money
dedicated
that was
for
collected
wildlife
last year. Yeah,
last
the
year.
money was collected last year and paid into the states this year. Yeah.
Okay, so but that 944 million was dedicated for wildlife conservation projects. It's
Yeah.
almost $1 billion.
Yeah. Yeah. And the year before it was 1.1 billion. So we're seeing it come down slightly as we see, sales of guns start to come down a little bit. But yeah, we've had a couple of record years for money
Uh-huh.
that's been going into the Pittman Robertson Fund. One of the other things too is that we were successful in changing the law several years ago for the Pittman Robertson Fund to be able to use that to actually construct new ranges or rehab old ranges, the public access ranges, so people can get out to shoot. We find is that people who can't get to a range, usually within an hour of where they live, just won't go shoot. But if they have
Mm-hmm.
access to a range within an hour, they'll get out there and shoot. So we're putting a lot of effort into make sure there are, safe and accessible public shooting ranges within an hour's distance of most of your population. So we're working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the state departments to be able to build new ranges so people can get out there and shoot. And that's kind of self-perpetuating. You make more access for people to be able to shoot. They're going to shoot more, and there's going to be more money coming back into the Pittman Robertson Fund. So, this is a way that we're able to, plant those trees that, under the shade of which we'll never sit under, but they'll be enjoyed by our grandchildren and their children. And that's something that, the people who came up with this idea with, Pittman and Robertson, when they came up with this idea for sustainable wildlife conservation from this tax, they thought that, at that time was to be able to have what we enjoy today, which didn't exist in 1937. You got to figure at that time, we're still in the Depression. There was a lot of issues with poaching. Market hunting had just went out in the early part of the century. So populations of wildlife were nothing compared to what we enjoy today.
But damn those bloodthirsty hunters. Jeez. So I don't know if you have this statistical breakdown, but I was going to ask you what percentage of the population owns a gun?
Yeah,
Legally.
so it's really tough to kind of get to that number. I think the one we probably rely on the most is Pew Research Service. They do a survey every year of gun owning households, and they come up with roughly 1/3 every year of households in America have a gun in it. I would caution people that that's probably a low estimate, because if you're going to cold call me on my cell phone and ask me about my guns, I'm going to hang up on you. But I talk about guns with media all the time because that's what I do. But they say 1/3 of Americans, so that would be over 100 million people, have a gun in the home.
And so what percentage of those are actually hunters? And this is just to prove the point that, yes, hunters are obviously, we're funding conservation, but hey, all these other Second Amendment enthusiasts that may not give a damn about hunting are doing the heavy lifting.
I don't have the numbers in front of me on how much are hunters, but we know that population is dwindling.
So I think there's like 6%, 6 or 7% of the population hunts, right? And 1/3 of the population owns a gun. So
owns a gun. Yeah.
Maybe.
So it really is the recreational target shooter, the self-defense shooter, who is, sustaining wildlife for us today. And we actually had a survey done by Southwick Associates this past year that went and talked to those people who never step foot into the field, never go into the woods, never walk into the marshes. They don't hunt. And they asked them, how do you feel about paying this tax? And overwhelmingly, to the tune of over 80% of them, felt very positive that the money that they were sustaining when they buy a gun or they buy ammunition, they're supporting these manufacturers. Of course, that cost is passed along to you and I, but they're very good that they're doing their part to sustain conservation, even though they may never get out there, because they know that it's not just you and I as the hunter who's enjoying that. It's also, healthy ecosystems, that the same, healthy environment for that deer or for that, quail to live in is also going to be a same healthy environment for, lizards and snakes. It's going to be a healthy environment for, amphibians to live in. These animals that aren't part of Pittman Robertson are also benefiting in the fauna and everything else that we're going, that goes into sustaining that healthy environment, and all the other people who enjoy it, the people who are non-gunners and non-hunters, the backpackers, the bird watchers, the horseback riders, all the other people who enjoy, America's great outdoor spaces, they can thank the Pittman Robertson Fund for being able to sustain that healthy public land access and wildlife conservation model that we all enjoy today.
What do you think is the biggest challenge we face as far as recruiting new sportsmen into the field? I think all you have to do is look at social media. Really, it's not a very friendly environment towards people that hunt or own guns. And when kids get on TikTok at the age of 12 or 13 or whatever it is, and that's like being imprinted in their brain, I don't know how we get this next generation in the social media driven society to get on board with what traditionally have been just fundamental American values and way of life.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you can look, probably the story's a few years old now, but if you look at what happened with Kendall Jones, she's right down there in Texas. She was, a social media star, if you will, at the time. And she still has a very strong social media following. And And of course, she runs a hunting outfitting business there in Texas. But she took a lot of flack for her safaris that she went on in Africa. And people, went after her for, harvesting the animals that she was harvesting overseas, without understanding, what was happening with that meat, what was happening with the money that was invested in those safaris, and how it was able to sustain those local villages that were supporting, her hunting efforts. They don't understand it, and it becomes very difficult, especially for someone who's a young teen and trying to understand this. I think we're making some headway. I think when you start to look at some of the bigger names in social media who are kind of pushing out, against some of this and talking about hunting in a more sustainable way than, just whack them and stack them, shows that maybe I watched when I was a kid. But when you watch things like on Meat Eater, and it's, Steve and Yanni are going out there and they're harvesting an animal, and they're showing that, hey, maybe not every hunt is always successful, and they're showing that, what they're doing with that animal after they harvest it, how to butcher it, how to prepare it, and how to eat it. But it's not just them. I mean, you look at Scott Lace's show. His whole thing is about taking that wild game
Mm-hmm.
from the field to the fork, and being able to show people, what food really is when it's not raised on a farm, or it's not raised on a ranch somewhere. That, this is sustainable food that's all around us, and it's part of our DNA. I mean, this is who we are as humans. We're predators by nature, and this is who we are and what we do. And this is good food, is healthy food for all of us. So I think that you're seeing some of the pushback. I think some of it is helping. Especially when you got people who are non-hunters watching shows that are talking about, kind of the holistic show, the idea of us connecting with one another, connecting with nature, and connecting with our food. I
Mm-hmm.
think that starts to change the attitude a little bit. But it is really tough, and I think social media is part of it. If I had the complete answer of all this, I'd probably be talking to you from the deck of my yacht somewhere in the
Right.
Caribbean. But it is a very difficult, thing for us to tackle, and I think there's a lot of social media pressures. I think our kids are to the winds all the time. My kids are grown and out of the house, but I've got grandkids now, and I want to make sure that they grow up with the strong hunting and outdoor angling, kind of traditions that I had. And I'm watching this, and there's no, sports. My grandson's 4, and he's already involved in 3 or 4 different sports.
Oh
He's
yeah.
he's riding dirt bikes with his dad. I mean, he's doing everything, and I love to see it all. But there are a lot of things pulling him in a lot of different directions. And I think that's part of it. It just
Mm-hmm.
becomes really important for us as parents, as grandparents, as mentors, to, carve out the time and make everything slow down. I remember my wife, you asked me many years ago, what is it about hunting that you like so much? My wife doesn't enjoy hunting. She doesn't want to sit out there in the woods with me. But she's like, what is it about you? And I said, it's because everything in the woods is not on my schedule. I have to slow it down. Everything else I'm doing, I have to knock out all those distractions. And I'm working on somebody else's schedule. I'm working on that deer schedule. I'm working on that duck schedule.
Yeah.
It's all up to them. I'm just part of their daily life now, and I need to adapt what I'm doing to them. So for me to be able to unplug from all the demands of life and go out there and reset my clock to be in tune with nature, it is cathartic for me. And I think that's probably what a lot of us enjoy about being out in the woods. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's something we need to pass along to view on our friends and our family. And I think it's important also, not just for the kids. I mean, we have a lot of adult onset hunters, right? And we need to be able to reach out to them and invite them. And it takes nothing more than just saying, hey, I've got an empty seat in the blind. Do you want to go with me? Or I've got an extra bucket in the dove field. Would you love? And I mean, what a great way to introduce someone to the shooting sports and hunting, and then sitting on a bucket, dove hunting a field, because you don't need to be quiet. You don't really need to sit still. I mean, that's a
Mm-hmm.
great place to do it. So, find ways to make yourself accessible and reach out to those people around you, invite them along.
One thing I've noticed living in Texas is the thing. Dove hunting is great. It's a great introduction, but I have more like curious first time wannabe hunters approach me about thermal hog hunting. Like they want to do that.
Yeah,
And I get it, right? It's cool and there's technology involved and it's something different.
yeah.
And part of it, it's like kind of like a video game when you're looking at these heat signatures through a thermal optic. And but I'm not kidding. Some of my friends from high school that we were our friendships were forged from church or sports or whatever. They're now like early 40s and like can you take me thermal hog hunting? I'm like, I've been trying to take you hunting for decades. And like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I want to go thermal hog hunting. So I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
well,
there is,
whatever gets you
yeah,
in. Yeah.
yeah, there's something fun about sitting behind a thermal. It's not a cheap way to start hunting. And of course, if
Right.
you've got a buddy who's
Well,
got
no, they want to
thermal,
use mine.
exactly. It's always a help to have a buddy who's already got a thermal. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's part of it is the marriage of the technology with the hunt. It's you know, cable. I mean, if you've got a buddy who's got a helicopter, I've got an AR, and I'll come on down to
Right.
Texas. I would love to do that. And I've had buddies who had a chance to do that too. But yeah, I mean, I think that any of these, and I think that once you start to open people up to hunting, no matter where their entry point is, they start to gain a different appreciation for it, especially when they see that, you know, one, it can be fun. It certainly can be safe. Hunting is one
Mhm.
of the most safe activities that we have out there, safer than some of our field sports like soccer and basketball. And it's a way to put food in the freezer. You know, it's not just, you know, knocking down a hog, or it's not just shooting a bird out of the sky. I mean, that's something that we're going to be able to put on our plate and feed our
Mhm.
families.
Yeah, my son graduated from 5th grade this week, and so they had a 5th grade skip day where they all just after the ceremony was in the morning, and they all just like, we're not going to school. And I said, that's fine. His mom and I said, you can skip school, but you're not going to come home and sit on your Xbox all day.
Yeah.
So him and his buddies were like, they're fishing. They went fishing. So he's
Yeah.
11. Which I was like, well, I'm proud of y'all for wanting to do that. And if you tell them you can't be on your devices, they're gonna do something else. Get outdoors.
Yep.
So
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you can't go wrong by putting a pole in their hand and give them a bucket and say, go down, fill it up, you know,
yeah,
see what
yeah,
they can do. You know, and
absolutely.
what a pride of accomplishment when they're able to bring a few fish home, even if it's just some panfish, and you're able to cook it up, be like, yeah, son, you brought this home and you fed the family.
Now, I'm not eating those fish from the neighborhood pond, but well, Mark, I certainly appreciate it. If you want to give us your website, if folks want to. I know it's an industry thing, but as far as uh,
Yeah.
the gatekeeper, that's who you guys are. So I encourage everybody to support NSSF. Tell your friends about it because you guys serve obviously a vital guardian to this administration and any others that want to come after our Second Amendment rights.
Yeah, I'd encourage people to check us out at nssf.org. That's NSSF, two S's, F.org. And you can click on there. If you look under the media tab or the news tab, you can find we're posting up blogs and press releases and a lot of the stuff that you were talking about and the references that you were making. It just comes right off of there. I mean, we're putting up
Mm-hmm.
as much information as we can to our members, and that's publicly available to anybody else who's not a member, so they can kind of keep abreast of what's happening in the state capitals and on Capitol Hill and how it's affecting uh, their ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights and their ability to get out and hunt and shoot. So
Mm-hmm.
we're active, and we encourage people to keep track of us.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Mark. Thanks again, and I'll look forward to our next visit.
Yeah, Cable, it's good talking to you. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure.